Welcome to Immigration and its effects on U.S. Hispanics and Latinos. In this video, I want to raise your awareness of the motives for immigrating to the United States and the effect of U.S. policy and immigration trends on Hispanics and Latinos in the U.S., as well as a few things about undocumented immigrants in the U.S. These are all issues that you are likely to encounter as you do contextualized ministry for Hispanics and Latinos in your scope. Immigration is a very disruptive thing to go through. I lived overseas for just 1 year on stint, and I thought that was disruptive. But immigration is for a lifetime. So a basic question comes up. Why go through with it? Why leave your country, your culture, your family, and so much else behind? People who study immigration talk about the historic motives behind immigration using both push and pull language. That is, people are either motivated by a push from their host country, a pull by their receiver country, in our case the United States, or sometimes both, a push and a pull. But whether it's a push or a pull, most immigration comes down to three basic categories. The first is economic opportunity. If you are lacking upward mobility, or if you sense a better opportunity, that can become a high enough motivation to immigrate. Second is political stability. Since the U.S. is relatively politically stable compared to some other countries, if your own host country is going through political turmoil, this can motivate you to immigrate. And third is just safety. If you are fleeing from gang violence or escaping persecution, this can obviously motivate you to immigrate. While it is hard to actually research immigration motives, it is typically believed that for non-refugees who immigrate, economics is the primary factor. This image is from a popular U.S.-Mexico border crossing. While not everyone in this photo is immigrating, it demonstrates another characteristic of immigrants, that they tend to follow patterns that other immigrants from their same country of origin have established. This is called the beaten path theory of immigration. Examples of this are the routes immigrants travel on, their mode of travel, meaning land, sea, plane, and the places they go in the U.S. when they arrive. Today, 91% of the Hispanics and Latinos in the U.S. live in urban areas, which is another testament to the beaten path theory. However, the size and dispersion of the Hispanic and Latino population immigrating to and remaining in the U.S. means that people are not just immigrating to established Hispanic and Latino destinations anymore, such as New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. They're also going to much smaller urban areas, like Akron, Ohio, and Detroit. It would probably be more accurate to say that there are many beaten paths that immigrants take to the United States, but that most of them end in cities, and that Hispanics and Latinos in the U.S. disperse in the country from there. A major reason why immigration systems can have explanatory power for Hispanics and Latinos in your scope is that, since the 1980s, the majority of immigrants coming to the U.S. are from Mexico and other Central and Latin American countries. This chart from the Migration Policy Institute shows the top 10 largest immigrant groups to the U.S. in 1980 by country. Mexico and Cuba are both on that list. In the 1990s, the Mexican share increased, but Cuba was still in the top 10. In 2000, Mexico was still number 1, but El Salvador joined the top list along with Cuba. In the 2010s, Guatemala and the Dominican Republic both joined the top 10, along with El Salvador, Cuba, and Mexico. And in 2015, the most recent data we have, all 5 countries still remain as top 10 immigrant origins. Mexico has been the largest sending nation of immigrants to the U.S. now for over 35 years. But what's the point? It's not true that U.S. immigration policies just affected Hispanics and Latinos. Technically, they affected all immigrants. But because the majority of those immigrating to the U.S. in recent history have been from Mexico and other Latin and Central American nations, modern immigration policies have had a disproportionate effect on the U.S. Hispanic and Latino population as a result. Also, it is worth pointing out that Puerto Rican relocation to the U.S. will never show up on a chart like this, since they all come to the U.S. as citizens. But we shouldn't forget in this discussion that Puerto Ricans still constitute a sizable portion of the Hispanic and Latinos living in the U.S. Further, Puerto Rican relocations to the U.S. have a lot in common with other immigrant groups, such as having similar motives and following the beaten path. Since immigration is not just a public policy, but also a political persuasion, and since CREW has some limitations here that I will touch on again later, I will be careful in this video not to endorse individual politicians or a particular political view. But even without CREW's political activity policy for staff, research has shown that not all U.S. Hispanics and Latinos living in the U.S. make immigration reform one of their top political priorities anyway. Regardless of the political tendencies, either of CREW, yourself, or the Hispanics and Latinos in your scope, U.S. immigration policies have had an undeniable effect on Hispanic and Latino communities in the U.S., and therefore, it will likely have an undeniable effect as you practice contextualized ministry in your scope. So here's a brief history of modern U.S. immigration policy. I always like to point out that the U.S. Bill of Rights never suggests that rights are just for citizens. But it's a fact you might miss just looking at the policy history. In the late 19th century, as immigration from Europe to the U.S. slowed down, there was a shift in immigration attitudes among majority culture U.S. citizens. This shift made its way into public policy. The Asian Exclusion Act of 1875 clearly demonstrated, even by its name, the blatant discrimination that had already been normalized in many pockets of majority culture in the U.S. In 1921, the Emergency Quota Act gave the U.S. immigration system a quota system based on national origin. But it wasn't until 20 years after the U.S. created a border patrol near the end of World War II that Mexican immigration began in large numbers to the U.S. In 1954, the so-called Operation Wetback was another obviously discriminatory initiative. It was handled by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS, and enforced by the Border Patrol with the help of local law enforcement. The initiative was wrought with civil rights violations. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act addressed some of the discrimination present in U.S. immigration policy and canceled the quota system, which until then had been in place for 44 years. The next big moment was in 1986, when the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, which granted green cards to about 2.7 million Americans. In 1990, the Immigration Act was a major modern era attempt at immigration reform with bipartisan support. The bill helped with the immigration increase that coincided in the next decade, when between 10 and 11 million people lawfully entered the U.S. Major surges in immigration for the past 25 years caused U.S. policy again to fall behind. The call for comprehensive immigration reform became an issue that was popularized in the evangelical church in the late 2000s, with the books like Welcoming the Stranger by Matthew Soerens and Jenny Yang, as well as Christians at the Border, written by seminary professor and Guatemalan American Danny Carroll. Around the same time, the phenomenon that DU Law professor Chris Lash calls crimmigration was getting popular. According to Lash, crimmigration is the intertwining of U.S. immigration and criminal justice policies and narratives. After 9/11, the crimmigration phenomenon was expanded to include national security policy and narratives. Soon after, there was a movement of cities that began declaring themselves sanctuaries for the undocumented. While there is no legal definition for a sanctuary status, many local municipalities created policies that were aimed at posturing themselves as friendly places for the undocumented, promising to keep undocumented citizens protected from deportation and limiting things like ID checks and other activities. The so-called sanctuary designation was picked up by other public institutions, such as university campuses and churches, who made similar promises. Next in immigration history came the DREAM Act bill, which proposed a citizenship path for qualifying U.S. residents, including child immigrants. The bill failed after being introduced several times in the U.S. House and Senate between 2009 and 2011. In 2012, the policy known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA, began. DACA allowed temporary work permits to be issued to qualifying undocumented U.S. residents without a criminal record. The policy was unique in U.S. immigration history, as DACA was not a bill signed into law. It was enacted instead by executive order by the President of the United States. It was intended to create immigration reform that was outside of the crimmigration rhetoric and in line with what the DREAM Act proposed. However, DACA was not a citizenship path, and it didn't carry the same force of law as a bill, like the previous bills mentioned in U.S. immigration history. So, in 2017, it was announced by Jeff Sessions that the DACA program would be rescinded, or that it would end. This was possible because it was never signed into law in the first place. Since the 800,000 or so people who signed up for the program had given their identification to the U.S. government in order to sign up, many of them as minors, the result was that many original DACA recipients, or people who called themselves documented, lost significant trust with the federal government. The man in this image is Mario Vargas. He was involved in a high-profile deportation case in Los Angeles in February of 2017. His daughter, Jersey, is in the foreground. Mario lived in the U.S. undocumented for 17 years. The Pew Research Center reported in 2015 that there were 11 million unauthorized immigrants like Mario in the U.S. Estimates show that around 5.6 million of those people are from Mexico. 66% of these people have lived in the U.S. for at least a decade, and that number is, of course, on the rise. Often, students who are undocumented refer to themselves as dreamers. This term goes back to the term that was used in the failed DREAM Act. The undocumented population in the U.S. lives with worries that citizens don't have. First, a lack of identification means that travel is difficult. Going out in any way by public transit, car, or flying is an opportunity for an unwanted ID check, which can lead to deportation. Second, employment is a challenge. Without a valid Social Security number, undocumented people must be creative to get work. Employers can turn undocumented workers in at any time. Third, future planning is hard. When your landlord can kick you out, your boss can fire you or turn you in, or a cop on the street can stop you and ask for your ID at any moment, it makes it difficult to put down roots. Fourth, conversation about family is often sensitive. Family separation is often an ever-looming fear or a current reality, as many undocumented people have family members in other countries, or fear of being deported from their family here in the U.S., sometimes both. A host of other challenges could be listed, from banking to healthcare. Then there is the public stigma to deal with, which can lead undocumented people to live in fear and distrust. Often, undocumented experiences vary based on your location in the U.S. It is important to notice that undocumented people are always first-generation immigrants. If they have children born in the U.S., those children are citizens, making it basically impossible to be a second-generation undocumented immigrant. Here we have a great quote from Andy Crouch. He says, "Some people choose a set of cultural ripples that was not originally their own. When they do so in pursuit of economic or political opportunities, we've traditionally called them immigrants. When they do so in pursuit of evangelistic or religious opportunities, we've called them missionaries. But as wheels within wheels overlap more and more in a mobile world, most of us have some choice about which cultures we will call our own. We are almost all immigrants now, and more of us than we may realize are missionaries too." This quote does a good job of what this video is intended to do. That is, tie the immigration system and missional realities in our country together. So here are some guidelines for practicing contextualized ministry based on immigration realities. First, be sure you know and can follow Cru's political activities policy in the Cru Handbook. You can actually endanger Cru's nonprofit and tax-exempt status with certain political activities related to immigration. If you have questions about this, your coach can certainly help. Secondly, think and act biblically about immigration issues. Danny Carroll points out that the Hebrew word ger, meaning stranger or foreigner, occurs in the Old Testament 92 times alone. It is greatly encouraged that you make immigration an issue in your discipleship and in your movement. Find ways to advocate locally and act justly toward immigrants, and capitalize on biblical themes and images related to immigration, such as citizenship, sanctuary, and exile. Third, watch your language. Make sure you are intentional to say undocumented person, not illegal alien. How you talk about undocumented people will demonstrate how safe you are to be approached by them or by others who are indirectly affected by the issue. Fourth, realize that undocumented people will need some special treatment sometimes. Be sensitive and take relationships with undocumented people slowly. It might take a while before they are open with you about their family and financial realities. Help educate undocumented immigrants about how to handle requests for an ID. There are many good programs that help undocumented people avoid providing IDs when it is not necessarily legal in the first place. And encourage emergency plans. Due to a lack of future planning, many undocumented people are not prepared for what to do in the event of a deportation of themselves or another family member. So this slide and the next one show the resources I used or cited in making this video. Thanks for watching.